My mother-in-law told me, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, that she simply hadn't included me on the gala guest list this year. Not out of malice, she was careful to say, but because it just wasn't the right environment for someone with my particular background. My husband sat across the table and said nothing. So I stayed home that Saturday in October, ate dinner on my own, and watched Netflix until my phone lit up with notifications I'd been half expecting all evening. The livestream of her charity gala was trending, not because of the charity, because my sister-in-law's fiancé had just been walked out in handcuffs by two OPP officers while 300 guests filmed it on their phones. I poured myself a glass of Pinot Gris I'd been saving for a good occasion, sat down on my couch and watched the clip 4 times. I knew exactly what had happened, I'd known for weeks. My name is Cora, I'm 31 years old, I live in Toronto, and I've spent the better part of the last 3 years being quietly, strategically underestimated by the family I married into. My mother-in-law. I'll call her that throughout because frankly that's the only role she ever let me play in her world, comes from old Toronto money. The kind that traces itself back 3 generations, talks about the cottage the way other people talk about a second bedroom, and measures a person's worth in alma maters and postal codes. She married into even older money. Their home in Rosedale has a name, not a street number, a name, engraved on a little brass plate beside the door. I noticed it the very first time my husband brought me there for dinner, and I should have understood everything I needed to know from that moment. My husband is the eldest of 2 children. His younger sister, I'll call her my sister-in-law, is the undisputed favorite. She's 34, impossibly charming in that easy, effortless way that people who've never had to worry about money tend to be. And she has never, in the 3 years I've been part of this family, asked me a single genuine question about my life. Not one. She does, however, refer to me as practical in a tone that makes the word sound like a medical condition. I grew up in Scarborough. My parents immigrated from Hong Kong in the late 90s and spent 20 years running a dry cleaning business on Kingston Road. I went to York University on a scholarship, got a business degree, and spent 5 years working 16-hour days at a Bay Street firm before I quietly left to start my own company. What I do now is technically private equity. I find undervalued real estate and hospitality assets in Ontario, acquire them when the owners are in distress, restructure them, and hold them. Some of them I sell, some of them I keep. The portfolio is worth considerably more than anyone in my husband's family has ever suspected. They think I do freelance financial consulting. That's the version I've offered, and they've never cared enough to ask further. The dinner that started everything happened on a Thursday evening in early September. My mother-in-law had invited the family to her house in Rosedale to celebrate the upcoming Gala, her annual charity fundraiser for a children's literacy organization, which she'd been hosting for 11 years, and which served, as far as I could tell, primarily as an occasion for her to assemble 300 people and remind everyone that she mattered. This year's event was different. She'd booked an estate venue in Prince Edward County, a beautiful winery property about 2.5 hours east of Toronto. And she'd been talking about it since spring. She'd also announced, quite proudly, that she was planning to make a personal charitable pledge of $250,000 at the gala, secured against the family's cottage in Muskoka. I sat at her dining room table that Thursday and ate poached salmon and said very little, which is my standard strategy. After the plates were cleared, she placed her hands flat on the table and looked at me with that particular expression, the one she reserved for difficult conversations she'd rehearsed in advance. "Cora," she said, "I want to speak with you about the gala." I waited. I've given this a great deal of thought, and I think you'll understand that events like this one require a very specific atmosphere. The guests are donors and board members and people who've known each other for decades. It's not really the kind of environment where a guest who isn't embedded in those circles would feel comfortable. She tilted her head slightly, and honestly, I think it would be uncomfortable for everyone. My sister-in-law was examining her fingernails. My husband was looking at his water glass. My mother-in-law continued, "I've put you down as a family contributor, not as an attending guest, but your name will be in the program. I think that's a lovely acknowledgement. A contributor in the program, like a footnote." I looked at her. I didn't raise my voice. Years of knowing that nothing I said would change anything had taught me to save my energy for the things that actually mattered. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. She blinked. She'd clearly expected resistance. My father-in-law, who had been silent throughout, reached for the wine bottle and changed the subject. My husband caught my eye across the table and offered a look I've come to know very well. Apologetic, slightly guilty, entirely insufficient. When the bill came at the end of the evening, we'd gone to the club my in-laws belonged to in Yorkville after dinner. I reached for it before anyone else could. "I'll take this," I said. My mother-in-law laughed, not unkindly. "Cora, it's nearly $400, don't be ridiculous." I set my card on the tray. It's a matte black metal card. It has no numbers embossed on the front. She looked at the way you'd look at something you couldn't quite identify. "Is that a gift card?" my sister-in-law asked, genuinely curious. "It's fine," I said. The card cleared in under a second. I added a 20% tip, signed the slip, and excused myself. By the time I came back, my mother-in-law had moved on to discussing this Gala seating chart. Nobody mentioned the card again. In the car on the way home, my husband reached over and touched my hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know she was going to do that tonight." "I know," I said. "She doesn't mean." "I know," I said again. He went quiet. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and when we got inside I poured myself a glass of water, went into my home office and called my business manager. Her name is Terrence and she's been managing my firm's assets and legal exposure since the beginning. She picks up on the second ring, day or night. That's why I pay her what I pay her. "I need a full title and lien review on the Muskoka property held in my father-in-law's name," I said. "And I want a dossier on a man named Declan, my sister-in-law's fiancé. He's been presenting himself as heir to an Okanagan winery operation, family trust claims, debt history, anything your team can surface." Didn't ask why. "Give me 48 hours, she said. She called back in 36. The Muskoka picture came first. 2.5 years ago, my father-in-law had quietly approached a private lending arm, one that happened to be managed through a subsidiary of my firm, seeking bridge financing against the cottage. He'd needed liquidity fast, and he hadn't wanted his wife to know how tight things had gotten. He'd used a broker as an intermediary, and the transaction had closed without either of us realizing who was on the other side. My firm held a registered lien on that Muskoka property. My mother-in-law's plan to borrow against the cottage for a $250,000 charity pledge was, legally, impossible. Any new financing application would surface our existing lien in a standard title search. The pledge that was meant to be the centerpiece of her gala didn't have a financial foundation to stand on. I sat with that information for a while. Then Terrence told me about Declan. He was 38, charming and deeply, thoroughly insolvent. His family did not own an Okanagan winery. They had owned one, a small operation near Oliver, BC, which had been sold under creditor pressure 6 years ago when his father's other ventures collapsed. Declan had continued presenting himself as heir to a wine empire using old photographs, outdated business documents, and a rental property in West Kelowna he described as the family estate in conversations. He was currently carrying significant unsecured debt and was being examined by the OSCs, the Ontario Securities Commission, in connection with a private investment fund he'd been soliciting from retirees in the GTA. 3 civil actions were outstanding from investors who claimed he'd misrepresented returns on a development scheme that never materialized. He had proposed to my sister-in-law 4 months ago. The diamond ring was financed on a personal line of credit he couldn't service. I didn't say anything to anyone. I kept going to family dinners. I kept smiling when appropriate. Then 10 days before the gala my phone rang. A Kelowna area code I didn't recognize. It was Declan. He opened with charm. He'd gotten my number from my father-in-law's contact list, he said. He'd always thought I seemed like the most grounded person in the family. He'd heard I did financial consulting and had a situation he needed to handle confidentially. Was I available? I was available. He took 45 minutes to get to the point, but the point was this. He needed $45,000 in Canadian funds transferred within a week. A payment obligation that couldn't wait. His liquidity was temporarily restricted due to a trust disbursement delay. He would repay me within 60 days. He suggested that given my position in the family, this could be mutually beneficial. He was, after all, about to become my brother-in-law. Family supported family. I asked gentle, apparently naive questions. Why couldn't he use the winery property as collateral? He became vague. Why couldn't his parents assist? His parents were traveling. Was the trust through a Canadian institution? Offshore, he said, which simplified things. He lied smoothly, and at length I let him. Let me see what I can do, I said. Send me the wire details. He sent them within the hour. I forwarded everything to Terence and told her to add it to the file. I did not send Declan any money. What I did instead was book my standing suite at the estate venue in Prince Edward County for Gala weekend. I should explain. 18 months ago, a boutique winery and events space in Peck, one of the most beautiful properties in that part of Ontario, known for its limestone terraced vineyard and a stone manor house that could accommodate 250 guests, had come to the end of its financing rope. The owners had overexpanded during a run of good years, taken on debt to renovate the event facilities, and found themselves underwater when two corporate contracts fell through simultaneously. They approached several private equity groups. My firm made an offer. We closed in December. We kept the existing management team. We kept the events calendar. We kept everything exactly as it was, because the property ran profitably and we saw no reason to interfere. My name appears nowhere in the public-facing branding. The ownership is structured through a numbered company, which holds through a trust managed by a holding company registered in Ontario. Standard enough that no one without a specific reason to dig would find me. My mother-in-law had booked the venue through an event planner in the spring, paying a very healthy rental fee that had gone directly into our accounts. She had spent months planning her annual charity gala on a property she didn't know I owned. I arrived at the estate on the Friday afternoon before the event. The property manager, Laurent, who had been with us for 14 months, met me at the private east wing entrance and walked me to the owner's suite. A self-contained space with its own staircase, a terrace overlooking the vineyard, and no connection to the guest areas whatsoever. Laurent was unflappable and professional. He knew the situation exactly. The gala client arrives tomorrow morning, he said. Full guest count 280, ceremony and dinner in the main hall, outdoor terrace for cocktail hour. Perfect, I said. I'll be on my terrace most of the weekend. Regular updates through the property system, please. Of course, Miss Cora. He paused. The client's final catering payment was due this week. We haven't received it. I looked out over the vineyard. The vines were turning gold in the October afternoon. Keep me informed, I said. Saturday morning came with a clear, cold sky, and the smell of fermenting grapes drifting up from the lower field. I had coffee on my private terrace and watched the event trucks arrive, and the setup crew begin moving tables through the main entrance below. 3 floors down, my mother-in-law stepped out of a black SUV in a camel wool coat and immediately began directing the caterers. She never looked up. By late afternoon, Laurent had sent me 3 system updates. The first was routine. The second noted that the client had been unusually demanding with waitstaff regarding champagne pours and table arrangements. The third was the one I'd been waiting for. The catering company's final invoice, $62,000, had been presented for settlement, and the certified check my mother-in-law had arranged was being returned by her bank. Insufficient funds. The account it was drawn from was overdrawn. My father-in-law had apparently made a large cash transfer earlier that week that had depleted the balance before the check could clear. Terence later confirmed he'd done it in a panic. He'd received an automated demand notice from our lien holding firm after submitting a new financing inquiry to a mortgage broker through a third party. He'd moved money, trying to quietly demonstrate liquidity. It had made everything worse. I watched from my terrace as Laurent walked across the courtyard to speak privately with my mother-in-law. Even from that distance I could see when the news landed. Her shoulders went rigid. She turned and said something to my father-in-law, who was standing nearby with a glass of sparkling water. He shook his head slowly. She said something else. He walked away. She found my sister-in-law next. Then Declan was summoned. I watched him listen, watched him pull out his phone, watched his face when the call he made produced nothing useful. Then I watched him look around the courtyard with the expression of a man who has run out of options he was ever honest about having. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later, his number. Cora, I know this is unusual, but I need to ask for your help tonight. It's urgent, please call me. I didn't call. I texted back, I'm actually nearby. Come to the East Wing private entrance around 7, we can talk. He arrived at 10 to 7, still in his tuxedo, bow tie undone. He looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in one afternoon. I offered him a chair on my terrace and poured him water, which he didn't touch. He talked for a long time, and the story that came out was not the polished version from his phone call 10 days earlier. The filters were gone. He was genuinely scared. He admitted, in fragments, that the trust disbursement didn't exist, that the winery empire was decades-old family history he'd been borrowing against socially ever since, that the $45,000 he'd originally asked me for had grown to 60, because a creditor who'd been patient for 6 months had run out of patience. He admitted that once the marriage was formalized, he'd been planning to encourage my sister-in-law to access the Muskoka property as a marital asset. He'd already spoken to a lawyer about how that pathway might work in Ontario. Then he looked at me with the expression of someone who believes he's found an ally. I need you to help me get through tonight, he said. You're smart, Cora, smarter than anyone in that room downstairs gives you credit for. Help me with this and I'll make sure you're protected on our end. Make sure I was protected on his end. My terrace has 3 mounted cameras, part of the estate's security infrastructure. High-definition, directional audio pickup. They'd been running the entire conversation. Let me make a call, I told him. Wait here. I stepped inside, closed the glass door behind me and texted Terrence. Full confession recorded. Send the OSC file to the RCMP liaison tonight. Ask Laurent to give local police a quiet heads up that there may be an enforcement action at tomorrow's event. Just a notification, nothing more. I went back outside and told Declan I'd need until morning to move any funds. He thanked me with the exhausted sincerity of someone who has nothing left to negotiate with. I walked him to the East Wing entrance and watched him cross back toward the main hall, where the gala dinner was beginning. Then I poured myself a proper glass of estate Riesling, went to my terrace and watched the dark vineyard for a while before bed. The arrest happened at 9:43 the following evening. 2 officers from the OPP had been in quiet contact with the event coordinator since mid-afternoon. They waited until after dinner, out of professional courtesy, and walked in through the main hall entrance during the Primsatu's s'mores portion of the evening. Declan was standing at the podium preparing to give a toast about honesty, commitment, and building something lasting with the woman you love. He was mid-sentence when they appeared at his elbow. He went completely still. Someone in the crowd gasped. My sister-in-law's hand went to her mouth, and then he was guided very calmly out through the side door. The livestream crew kept the camera running for nearly a minute before anyone thought to cut the feed. I watched the clip from my terrace with my wine, still night, cold, the vineyard dark and beautiful below. What happened in the hall afterward, I learned from Laurent's updates, and later from my husband, who'd been seated at the family table. My mother-in-law stood and announced to the room that there had been a misunderstanding and that everything was under control. The guests did not believe her. The room began to thin. Several board members of the charity organization collected their things without speaking to anyone. The event photographer packed up and drove back to Kingston. My mother-in-law then attempted to proceed with her pledge announcement anyway. She called my father-in-law over. There was a conversation I was not present for, which ended with him sitting back down with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. She demanded to speak with venue management. Laurent called me at 11:15. The client is requesting a meeting with ownership, he said, perfectly neutral. She's been informed the property is privately held and the owner is on site this weekend. She's insisting. Send her to the executive room, I said. Give me 10 minutes. I changed into a blazer, finished my wine, and took the private staircase down to the administrative wing. They were already there when I pushed open the door. My mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my sister-in-law, and my husband, who looked like he hadn't fully processed the last 3 hours. Seated around the meeting table in formal wear that no longer looked appropriate for anything. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. The silence stretched. My mother-in-law was the first to speak. What on earth are you doing in here? Her voice was flat. She was running on fumes and etiquette. You asked to meet the owner, I said. She looked at me, then at Laurent, standing near the door with his hands clasped behind his back. Mrs. Cora's firm acquired this property 18 months ago, he said. She holds majority ownership through a private holding company registered in Ontario. This estate has been operating under her management since January of last year. My father-in-law closed his eyes. My sister-in-law made a sound, not quite a word. My mother-in-law looked at the table, then at me, then at the table again. The expression on her face went through several versions of itself before settling on something I had never seen there before: the complete and total absence of composure. You've been here, she said very quietly, this whole time. I came for the weekend, I said. I had no intention of attending your event. I have my own suite upstairs. The Muskoka pledge. Any new financing against the cottage will surface our existing registered lien, I said. My firm holds an interest in that property. It's been on title for 2.5 years. The pledge can't be funded that way. My father-in-law opened his eyes. He looked older than I'd ever seen him look. I placed a single folder on the table. Inside, a 1-page summary of the lien registration, the property records, the lender name that appeared on the paperwork he'd signed, his own signature at the bottom. You didn't know it was my company, I said. And I didn't know it was your cottage until after we closed. I chose not to say anything because I thought you might find a way to stabilize on your own. You nearly did a few times. The room was quiet for a long time. My sister-in-law looked at me steadily. She has her mother's composure when she chooses to reach for it. Did you know about Declan? She asked. I suspected before the gala. I confirmed it when he contacted me asking for $60,000. She absorbed that without expression. He came to you. He assumed I was the one in this family who could be managed, I said. She looked at the table. He told me I had the wrong idea about you, she said quietly. He said that last month. I thought he was being generous. She paused. He wasn't being generous, was he? No, I said, he wasn't. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't outline conditions or make demands. I let the facts stand in the room and breathe on their own, which is something facts are very good at when you finally stop shielding people from them. Laurent arranged for the estate's courtesy car to take my in-laws to a hotel in Picton. My husband stayed behind. We sat together in the meeting room after everyone else had left. He is a good man. That has never been the problem. I'm sorry, he said. I should have said something at dinner. When she... Yes, I said you should have. He didn't argue with that. We drove back to Toronto on Sunday morning and talked for most of the 2.5 hours. Not about his mother, not about Declan, not about the property or the pledge or the OSC file. We talked about us, about what I had needed from him for 3 years and what he had not been providing, and about whether that silence was something we could genuinely repair, or whether we'd both gotten too comfortable pretending it didn't exist. That conversation is still ongoing. I don't know yet how it ends. What I know is this: my mother-in-law called me 2 weeks after the gala to ask about the Muskoka property. Not to apologize, to ask whether my firm would consider a discounted buyout of the lien so the cottage could be listed privately without the encumbrance affecting the sale. I told her I'd have Terrence send over the terms. She thanked me, in that same careful, measured voice she always uses, the one that never quite reaches the eyes. I was polite back, I always am. But I did not apologize for existing. I did not apologize for owning things. I did not apologize for being exactly who I am, someone who built something real from nothing, not for spite, not for revenge, but because that is what you do when no one is handing you anything and the only person you can rely on is yourself. The clip of Declan's arrest is still circulating in certain corners of the internet. My sister-in-law has retained a lawyer. The OSC investigation is ongoing. The literacy charity, to its considerable credit, decided to run its gala again next spring with new leadership and a budget that doesn't depend on pledges nobody can actually afford. My mother-in-law has not included me in the program. I take that as progress.